Okay, and we're going live in
just waiting for people to sign on before I go off on one. I can see the numbers just crunching up. 52, 100, 200. This is amazing. It's all happening. Excellent, 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 excellent. For those that have joined us already, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I feel a bit like a radio host, but there we go. Thank you so much for joining us today. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce myself as your host for this webinar on CQ and negotiation. CQ, cultural intelligence, that's what the webinar is going to be all about. So I am Ritika Wadhwa, Chief Operating Officer of CQ Center UK. And why am I the host, or why am I, so to speak, the authority on CQ? Well, I'm not, but here's a little bit around why I feel like I am in a space where I can share my knowledge about CQ with you. I have traveled, studied, and worked across 3 continents. Before joining the CQC, I have held several other roles across marketing, sales, procurement within the public and private sector. And on top of that, as a first-generation immigrant to the UK and a woman of color, I'm very passionate about the role of cultural intelligence and its impact in our lives. So what are we going to cover in the next hour or so? Before we jump into the meat, the real thing, I'm just going to have to go through some of the basics with you. So please bear with me on that. Please feel free to add any comments in the chat. Send us your questions via the Q&A tab. And if we cannot answer them now, we will try and send you an email response. You are automatically muted and your cameras are off. The webinar will be recorded and available to share or view through our website. So we are here today to discuss how CQ can affect our ability to negotiate. Before I jump into introducing our amazing panelists for today, I want to quickly review CQ, cultural intelligence, for those that are just starting to explore CQ. So what is CQ? What is the big deal about cultural intelligence? Cultural intelligence, in a nutshell, is the capability to relate and work effectively in culturally diverse situations. It is a skill that everyone can develop and is comprised of 4 capabilities that you can see on your screen right now. CQ drive, that's the first capability. It is how you feel in multicultural situations. CQ knowledge, it is what you understand about the cultures involved in a situation. CQ strategy is how you plan and interpret in multicultural encounters, drawing upon your drive and your knowledge. And lastly, CQ action. It is what you actually do when you are in multicultural context. There, CQ in a nutshell, crash course, you heard it here. So what is negotiation and what's the link between those two? When you hear the word negotiator, does the image of James Bond come into your mind? Yes, no. Not too bad for some of us if that image does come into our mind. But the Cambridge Dictionary defines it as the process of discussing something with someone in order to reach an agreement with them. We are always negotiating, be it about screen time with our children or big business deals. It is said that our ability to negotiate is absolutely indispensable to everything we accomplish in life. So how does cultural intelligence tie into this? Well, you're going to find out in the rest of our time together And this segues beautifully into giving me the opportunity to introduce the panelists. We have a very diverse, beautiful panel from Riyadh to San Diego to the UK. We've covered the world in this panel. And Monica, would you like to kick off with introducing yourself, please?
Lovely. Good day, good morning, good afternoon, wherever it is that you're connecting from today. I'm very pleased to be with you. Thank you for the opportunity. Big applause for Cultural Intelligence Center for all of the great work that you do. I have had opportunity to go through some of the materials that you have issued, some of the strategies, and I'm absolutely overwhelmed. So having said that, let me introduce myself to the people that are with us this afternoon, evening, wherever it is, or whatever time that is. My name is Monica Sanz, and I consider myself a citizen of the world. That's how I present myself always. I work for KPMG SLC, that is KPMG Saudi Levant Cluster, as a senior manager and an IDE advisor. I love my job, and I was just telling Ritika, Neelu, and the rest of the people on the panel that I really do not mind to work very long hours. I'm very blessed to be able to have this job, really, and I can stay on my laptop, go to meetings at any time. It's always a pleasure. Sometimes I'm tired, but I love doing it. I consider myself a citizen of the world because I've lived in so many different countries, and I've grasped many different cultures. And so I really can't say where I come from, but hey, wherever it is that you throw me, I'm very happy to be and honored to be with you this afternoon for more deliberation on cultural intelligence and how negotiation affects it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica. That is a global citizen in a nutshell. Neelu.
Hello, Ritika, and the wonderful panel and everyone who's joined in. Thank you so much for your time, first of all, for investing in you. I'm Neelu Agarwal, first Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Lead for the Prudential Regulation Authority, Bank of England. Ritika asked me a question in our pre-conversation ahead of this panel that what establishes you, Neelu, to be on this panel? Can you talk a bit about that? And I was like, that's a great question. Reflecting on my journey, it felt like I've earned a decent amount of cultural intelligence currency and capital. And I would say so because I've traveled to about some 20 countries so far, have been brought up within different cities in India, I've studied in multiple schools and colleges, in different cultures, in the diversity land, which is India. I've worked in Mumbai and in London, have worked in the private sector and the public sector. Within the Bank of England, I've done about 5 or 6 completely different roles, which range from policy advisory to policy implementation to organization-wide strategy to cultural transformation projects. And each of these things have equipped me to work with lots of different people, with lots of different outlooks, with people who come from subcultures within their cultures. And yeah, I think that exposure, in particular as a DEI lead role, where negotiation is an essential skill, you have to sway the hearts and minds of people by taking everybody along in this journey and not letting people feel like if something is happening for one and not the other, it gives them the right to not stand behind the action. You have to make everyone an ally on an action. Hence, I think negotiation and CQ is a very important skill, and I'm happy to share my lessons learned in this journey.
Thank you so much, Neelu, for that introduction. Dave.
Yeah, thank you, Ritika. It's such a joy to be with everyone, and just fills my heart to not only be with these delightful panelists, but to see people from all over the world that are joining us, many familiar names and others of you that I don't have the privilege of knowing. Yeah, very briefly, I'm privileged to be part of the team that founded the Cultural Intelligence Center and have been engaged in this work for the research side almost 20 years. And along with the founding research members, Lin Vin Dine and Soon Ang, I've always kind of been the application guy. why. Like, okay, it's really important that this be researched, and I'm the nagging voice that's like, but so what? How does this actually make a difference in the work that we do at a national level, community level, in our organizations and our own personal relationships? So that's what makes me so excited about these kinds of sessions, that we get to translate all the academic rigor into real life relevance to, as you said, Ritika, something that I think we're all doing every day, including right now. I see some of you negotiating to connect with people through LinkedIn. That's great. Like, what a great way to use the chat. So back to you, Ritika.
Thanks, Dave. Yes, it's phenomenal that not just the panelists, but our audience has signed in from all over the world, which is why the relevance of this session is brilliant. So my first question, Monica, let's start with you. What does negotiation for a global citizen like you mean?
I could dwell on that for hours. Thanks for the question, Ritika. There are so many different ways to put it together. But before I start answering your question, let me say a quote that Harvey Mackay said, the successful businessman and author. He said, "You do not get what you want, you get what you negotiate." Another thing that is also important to understand is that for me, or from my understanding, negotiation is basically a part of culture, a very important part of culture. The concept of culture being a social, collective behavior manifests as well through negotiation. In this case, a manifestation of culture, because it embodies a certain code of conduct that is oriented towards civilized ways of solving disputes. So instruments of the negotiation are, for example, culture and diplomacy, right? So for me, from my experience, if I can't have the culture present, the culture element present, I am not able to properly negotiate. I need to understand the counterpart. I need to feel, there's a lot of psychology involved. I need to feel and understand the counterpart in order to negotiate. And another point that I wanted to say as well, related to what negotiation is for me, is empathy. When I come to negotiate, an important point is I need to understand what the other part or the other person or the other side would find as a win. And then I can start negotiating. So that's more or less what I'm thinking of on top of my head right now. Thanks, Ritika. On to you, Neelu.
That's a great question, Ritika. It's really interesting because within the Bank of England, at least, we never talk about the term negotiation, because negotiation as a term appears to be like a win for someone and a loss for the other. But we usually tend to use the term influencing a lot more, which is not about you winning or I winning. It's about us winning together, because we are operating for the financial system where even if one of us loses, everyone loses. So so for me, it's collaborative problem solving when I'm talking to my team members or with my seniors or with my peers. Negotiation for me is about sitting together, having a dialogue where we are able to put our individual interests in a joint discussion and able to solve a problem. And I think the three things that are really important here would be credibility, your own homework, and empathic listening. The segue into pre-negotiation is as important as the moment of negotiation itself. If you haven't spent enough time to assess your stakeholders, where are they coming from? What are their needs? How much time do they have? Are they as interested in this as I am? What are their priorities? What is their manager's priority? Have I given them enough time to digest this information? Did I make them feel that they had the power and equal say? Or did I go to them saying that this was already decided and pre-decided and they didn't have any power and influence in negotiation? Taking care of the soft skills, how you deliver, and the research, and ensuring that you took their perspectives into account is really important to get the right outcomes. So yeah, that's how important negotiation is for us. We are policy makers. What we do impacts the financial services industry. It has a domino effect globally. So the more perspectives, the more consultation, the more the challenge, the better it is.
Dave, are you itching to link it? I'm just thinking, isn't that all about CQ? Going back to the framework I referred to, so I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, I was about to say to you, really, we only get an hour because there's already so much in what Monica and Neelu have said that to me have culture sprinkled all throughout them. And I mean, Neelu, even your example of, well, we don't even use that word in our bank, but walk across the street to Citi and I bet they are comfortable using it. So just the combination of a public enterprise versus private. And I'm jumping ahead of what I know we're going to talk about, but is it a win-lose or win-win? Like even that has some cultural assumptions. But, to your overarching question to us, Ritika, building on what Monica and Neelu had said, I think very similar to how you set it up, Ritika. For me, negotiation, like to be honest, the very first thing I do think of when I hear the word is a bit of the James Bond. And we've had the privilege of not working with James Bond, but of CQ working together with military forces and governments and talking about it very high level, one nation negotiating with another, hostage freedom, etc. How does CQ play a part in that? I would say far more common of what I'm probably thinking about it in related to the research and the work that we do across the world is how does it apply in mergers and acquisitions or contractor relationships, and to part of what already Monica has said, like how do I empathize with what they're going to care about and what they're going to want? I mean, to your point, Ritika, that's at the crux of cultural intelligence. We sometimes call it perspective taking alongside of empathy. But then where you also started us, Ritika, I think we're all doing it all day long with our kids. We do a lot of work, all of us in the EDI space, the diversity space, and talking to an underrepresented group, like how are you going to negotiate that you should be paid equally, but not burn bridges, so how do you kind of factor through these negotiations on behalf of yourself, or for those of us who need to be allies, how do I negotiate on behalf of people who aren't getting paid equitably? So yeah, to my point, really, we only get an hour because there's so much here we can talk about in terms of how does cultural intelligence play a part in effective negotiation. So I look at it pretty holistically. I think it was you, Monica, who said we're all negotiating all the time, or something like that. Like it's such a core skill that we all. What was the quote you mentioned to the individual at the beginning?
Sorry, so I was saying to be empathetic. The first quote that I said was, "You do not get what you want, but you
That's
get
right.
what you negotiate."
Right,
From Harvey
exactly.
McKay.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that
Love
just
that.
captures it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry,
You
Ritika.
get
So
you get what you negotiate. Absolutely. Just sort of the more Monica, Neelu, and Dave are talking about what negotiation means for them in their work context and personally, the whole doing the credibility, having the credibility, doing the homework, listening. So doing the homework is your CQ drive, is your CQ knowledge, going back to sort of our framework that I referred to earlier, and the planning, the CQ strategy is the planning based on that homework, the empathetic listening skills. All of that is linking back to the framework. There is already a question from the audience, which is similar to the question I was going to ask anyway. But Dave, I'm going to come to you for this one first. I wanted to ask, can culture affect how we negotiate? Hang on. Can
yes.
culture affect? And before I go into the can culture, of course, we want to step back and articulate the definition of culture at the Cultural Intelligence Center. And culture is a set of behaviors that we identify with, which goes beyond the norms of nationality. Having said that, can culture affect how we negotiate? But also, someone is asking, is there a particular model of culture that we recommend? If so, why? So, Dave.
I was being a bit obnoxious and saying yes, but absolutely, and in every way, and how does it affect negotiation? How does culture affect negotiation? I mean, to keep it fairly at the high level right now, before we really get into some of the ins and outs and concrete examples, I think a couple of the biggest ways that it affects it are what motivates me may not motivate you. So coming to Monica's point on empathy, and culture is not the only thing, but is a big part of what motivates me versus you. So even we use is this a win-win? Is it a win-lose? I mean, some cultures, there is just going to be a notion of there needs to be a winner and there needs to be a loser, or this negotiation has not been effective. That changes very much the way you go into it as compared to, a more, at least on the surface level, Western notion that's been like, no, we're all going to have a win-win. My job is to make you win, etc. So for me, motivation is huge, and that's linked to culture. And the other one is trust. And Neelu, you talked about what's going to establish my credibility. I think, that links very much to trust. And, to give a couple concrete examples, in some cases, who you've worked with before in the region or in the market or in the industry is a huge part of establishing trust for some cultures. There's other cultures, organizational, national, etc., where telling me that I'm going to be the first and I'm the first adopter is part of what builds me trust. Well, to your point, CQ strategy is really going to help, because if I've actually planned and anticipated what are the drivers that are going to help you there. I'm not sure I entirely understand the question of what model of culture, but I'll take my own swing at that. To use a baseball metaphor, and I don't do baseball, so there's CQ action not working very well because of idioms there. Anyway, see, this is the problem when you live in this space. You rethink everything that you say. But one way that I would say that we think more about culture is what we call more of a culture general approach rather than a culture specific. And so the way I would distinguish that is, Monica, you and I have not had much opportunity to interact directly, but vicariously, I know a bit about your work with KPMG through Ritika. And so you take a very global body like KPMG, and if somebody says, here's what I need to know to negotiate with these people I'm going to meet with in Riyadh, what culture should you actually understand when you're going into Riyadh? If you're going to presume I'm going to be dealing with all very traditional Saudis when I go there, you may be totally off. And so our approach is, rather than obsessing over, I'm going to Riyadh and here's everything I need to know about Saudi culture. That's not irrelevant. Like if you're a woman going to Riyadh, you probably ought to dress differently than you may if you're going into London. But as you're interacting in the negotiation space, you might totally erode trust and credibility if you go in there with a more micro idea of culture, rather than what we try to do with cultural intelligence is, how do you read the cues in the room? How do you adjust on the fly and go, oh, actually, I'm dealing with a very Western model. I'm not saying any of this is true, Monica, I'm making it up, but I'm dealing with a very Western negotiator at this point, etc. So those are a couple things that come to mind, but a resounding yes on culture weaves through everything. The last thing I'll say, and I promise I'll turn it back over to you, Ritika, is I do think those of us in the space have to be careful to not make everything about culture. It's not always culture that's involved. I may assume Ritika's doing this because she's an Indian Canadian married to a Greek British person. It might be nothing to do with those cultural aspects. It might be something about who Ritika is and a personal objective motivation that she has right now. So we have to kind of extrapolate, but that's where CQ helps us as well. The CQ knowledge will help you figure out, is this a cultural thing that I'm dealing with, or is this actually something personal or organizational? So I'll quit talking.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks. And that reminds me never to share personal details with you again. You always have a way of bringing it up and putting that in the spotlight. But that brings us nicely to Monica, who not only has a hand raised, but I'm intrigued to hear what you have to say, Monica.
Thank you, Ritika. I just wanted to go further into the conversation about how do we deal culturally with other people. And just from what I'm thinking at the moment after hearing what David said is a question that I'll just ask everyone. Why do we always think about people as nationalities? Me too. Why do we always look at people from the lens of race or age? Within the work that I do right now, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to shift, which is going to be a huge job and a very long campaign because change takes a lot of time, but is looking at people from a capability point of view. if this is at work, if we're talking professionally. If I'm talking on the personal level, then looking at people from the lens that I want to relate to them to, either if we connect culturally or we connect on an activity basis. But if I'm talking about work, David, back to your point there, if we try to, when we are negotiating, if we try to look at people from a capability perspective of what do these people do and what do they want from me and what I can offer them without really looking at them from the external shape, it's going to help. And I am talking from my personal experience. So when I go into a room, really anywhere in the world, first of all, what really helps a lot is the language. Really helps so much to be able to speak the language. And I mean verbally speaking the language. Comes afterwards, your body language. Is this body language accepted where I'm going? That's a little bit of work to do, right? But generally, that was the point. I'm just throwing that question in. Why don't we shift looking at people, forgetting how people look like? Because sometimes the image is not really what is going to help us specifically in business. And we obviously know that from experience. Thanks for letting me say that.
I'm
Thank God.
conflicted because I love where you're wanting to go with that aspirationally. There's part of me that's like, because the reality, everyone does instantly judge someone based upon gender, race, skin color. So I wonder if it's a both and. Now I'm trying to negotiate with you, Monica. It's a let's call toward capability where, I'm always a fan of saying we're never about lowering the standard. We're just making sure that we've truly given everyone equitable opportunities to be considered for a role or a contract or whatever. Yeah, so I'm thinking out loud. I would be a little cautious, and maybe I'm misinterpreting what you were intending if we were to overreact. And I don't imagine in your role you're calling for a colorblind approach, but if we were to say, doesn't matter what race or gender you are, let me just see what your skills are.
In an
I
ideal
did mean that,
world.
David. I did mean that, Dave, and it does
Okay.
work. It does work. I have had the wonderful opportunities and chances to meet with different people, and I've just applied it. I went through the risk. It was a challenge for me to do that, and I did it, and it did work. I did have to do, although a little bit of homework related to obviously the type of business and the type of people that I was meeting, of course. So you need to do a little bit of profiling because knowledge is power. If I didn't have that power, I wouldn't be able to negotiate, right? But again, if we come up with that, so if we present ourselves through that mentality, that I am not looking at people from a Saudi lens perspective or from an Arab lens perspective, because the reality is that if you right now come to Saudi Arabia, you might not necessarily negotiate with a Saudi person. And what if you did? A Saudi person is probably brought up the same way as you and me, or like Neelu. That is something that you might not necessarily know when you come to the negotiation table. And this is what I just want to raise the flag there, because sometimes that frame that we build or that image, the bias that we might have might actually stop the negotiation or not help us forward.
And that's part of being a culturally intelligent leader yourself, isn't it? If you are culturally intelligent, then you automatically, so to speak, get over the biases or privileges. And yeah, I'm waffling there. So just a quick, sorry, before I go to Neelu, folks, everyone in the audience, could you please type your questions in the Q&A, because there's a wonderful chat going on. I'm not going to be able to sift through the amazing questions coming in as well. So just to make sure we cover your question, please type it in the Q&A and not in the chat. Thank you. Neelu, can culture affect how we negotiate?
Indeed, I 100% agree with that. And if I had to reflect on the times where when negotiation was stressful for me, it was only because I was not aware and I didn't act on the cultural norm at first. For example, what's culture? Culture is, that's how it's done. That's how I think. That's how I like it. And when you are aware of that thing, which is applicable to everybody, even I have that thing. When somebody comes to me for approval or to negotiate on something, there is a very clear FAQ that pops up in my head. Have you considered this? Have you thought about that? Have you thought about what's happening in the wider bank? What is the industry doing? And if they're able to pre-address those questions and know how I think, it's easier for me to come on board and negotiate with them. And that's applicable to everybody that I've dealt with so far in my jobs and even in personal life. Sometimes on DEI, some people think about, oh, you're talking about race, but what about disability? And some might not look at it with that angle. Some may just look at it with, okay, you're prioritizing race, that's how it should be done. Some might be like, oh, but this is just an idea. How sustainable is it? They might not even talk about diverse groups. They might just talk about the strategy and its embedding. Some might be like, okay, there are 5 things going on. I just want you to tell me that one thing that you need to do. So I've understood through my journey of doing this job and even the previous roles that everyone has that language, that thing that you will see them talking about again and again and again. And if you're able to prioritize that, pre-address that in your narrative, in your pitch, it makes it so much easier, because now they understand that you have embraced their truth, and then they'll accept your truth as well. There will be space for you to share your truth, share your ideas, share what you want to negotiate on. But it has to start with you using the right vocab as well. When we negotiate at times, the mistake that I used to make quite often is, oh, this is the idea, this is what I want to do, this is why I think it's important. And it was only recently that I read this really interesting article which said, remove yourself from the equation. People are more likely to buy into what you're trying to say when you source somebody external. This is what the data says. This is what the external analysis says, because then it's not about you winning against them. This is about somebody external, a fact, which needs to prevail over both of us. So yeah, I think it's been very, very important for me in my journey. Even on a personal level, I'll say that when you go to meet your in-laws or you go to meet your family in India, the first thing that I would do is, join my hands, say a namaste, or touch the feet of my elders. And I think if I wouldn't do that, perhaps they wouldn't, that's the first thing they will remember if I leave the room, that, the cultural norm was not addressed, no matter how nice I was in that meeting with them. So I think it's really important. And just last example, in my last organization, very interestingly, there was one unit that used to work with global rating agencies, with a global center, and the other one was the domestic center. So within the same building, on 2 different floors, one had a sir and ma'am culture, and the other had a no sir and ma'am, call people by name culture. And I know that if I was to write an email with a dear sir and ma'am to the global wing, they would be like, please, no. And if I was to use name for the other floor, they would feel disrespected because I did not respect the hierarchy. So that's how important culture is in negotiations. And I'm sure I would lose the battle right away in that introduction email if I wasn't aware of the cultural norms of the place.
Can I just say, Neelu, so you not touching your in-laws' feet is an issue. When I went to Greece the first time and I tried to do that to my Greek in-laws, they freaked out. Oh my God, don't do that ever again. What are you, literally, that was the end of that. And for me, I was thinking, how am I ever going to display my respect for them every time I meet them? Because they're not allowing me to touch their feet. So I guess just even from a same culture, but different context, how does that work? I love this question. So coming on to this next, Monica, common pitfalls when negotiating with people and organizations from different backgrounds. What's your experience?
Well, I think that Neelu just mentioned a few. So generally, it's taking for granted that you actually know what's going to happen. That's the first thing. You come into the room, you've done your homework, you've studied the organization, you know the points that you want to negotiate, and you come so sure of yourself that you think that you're winning. And a pitfall has been to me that you're too sure of yourself and you don't give enough space for the other to come closer to you. And that's something that I've repeatedly done in my early years, not that old, but in my early years. And that would have been one of the things that today is just the contrary. I come in a very humble manner, yes, with my homework done, but in a very humble manner, waiting to hear first and see first, and with a lot of empathy to be able to understand. And once I understand what the other side needs, then I start negotiating what my needs are. And again, I always try to give that space, whether it is that they're negotiating from their side or I'm negotiating with them, right? It doesn't matter who needs what from who. At the end, we're both needing things from each other. But I just sit and wait and try to give us enough space to be able to comprehend really what is the matter of the subject and what is it that we at the end of the day want. So that would be one that I would share. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Dave, do you have lessons learned, common
Yeah,
pitfalls?
it's interesting you started with assumptions, Monica, because that was the first thing that came to my mind, though I was thinking about it in a slightly different direction. But it comes back to the point that all of us have been talking about of empathy and perspective taking. And I was thinking more about my assumption of what the other party would find to be a win. And that's where I've seen a lot of pitfalls, is assuming that price point is what's going to most do it, or as I already mentioned, well, look at all these other people who are doing it. And I'm often on the receiving end of that, people coming at me and trying to pitch me with something. I'm like, you haven't even asked me a single question to know what's actually of value and importance to me. So that's one. I think, probably the biggest pitfall that I think about as it relates to Cultural Intelligence Center is so much of the formalized writing, training, work in negotiation assumes a low power distance and an individualist kind of mindset and perspective, and so there's this assumption that the Western model of negotiating is what's going to work well for you in China. And along with that, this doesn't necessarily reflect power distance and individualism, but a very aggressive, assertive, show them who's in charge. Sometimes even like these negotiating seminars talk about like showing power through volume and physical space and all that. And absolutely can derail negotiations in a lot of places. Another pitfall that's somewhat related to what I just said, but maybe from the other direction, is Westerners who might miscalculate the importance of relationship building for a corporate negotiation that's going to happen in a place. So maybe disregarding that the dinner after the time in the office when in Beijing is really not optional, even though it was presented that way, because it's where we'll find out whether or not we can really trust you. But a Westerner who might be like, I'm so exhausted, I'm jet lagged, I'm going to pass on dinner tonight. And whoa, you just lost the whole deal because you cut out relationship. Vice versa, though, the assumption coming into a Western environment that relationship should actually be what informs and guides the negotiation, where it may be like, I don't need to have dinner with you. Let's talk about the contract terms. Are we in or not? So, I'm picking a lot on the Westerners, but it can also go the other direction where there's an assumption of that. Quick example, if I can share it. We were doing through the Cultural Intelligence Center some work with AT&T in the US a few years ago, and particularly as they were expanding into Mexico with DirecTV. And one of the vice presidents that was helping with that was Mexican American, and his brother was vice president of one of the biggest banks in Mexico. And they were needing financing for part of this. And so US brother says, let's work with my brother's bank because they'll really give us a good deal. And US corporate is like, no, like, we can't do that. Like, that's nepotism, that's conflict of interest. He's like, my brother wouldn't do us wrong. That's exactly why we should work with him. So it was just kind of a classic case of the very same thing was considered break the deal versus win the deal from two very different cultural perspectives. So, coming way back to the overarching one that Monica and I shared, assumptions of what I think is going to make for a good deal, these all kind of come back to pitfalls that we can be unaware of due to our cultural assumptions and background.
I love that. Don't assume anything based on the way people look. Don't assume anything based on going into the negotiation or what they might want. Going in with curiosity and an open mind is what I'm hearing. Neelu, what do you think are the common pitfalls?
Well, a very honest perspective from my personal experience, I think the first one would be lack of humility. I used to often be like, oh, I'm so passionate about doing this. I've done my research, I've done my analysis, I know it all. And if the other person disagrees, they probably don't know what I'm talking about. That's a very wrong way of approaching any negotiation, which is not knowing that you don't know everything. Even if you think you do, because you've done a lot of research, there is still a possibility for somebody else's truth and perspective. And now it's all about reaching out to people with, this is what I think, what do you think? I'm trying to explore this idea. And that's the first thing that I would recommend people to avoid. Don't start with judgments and labels if you get disagreement. Be open to the possibility that you don't know everything, and you may not have all the perspectives that you would have ideally liked to take into account. The second thing in the pitfall, I would also say, is your delivery. Imagine a scenario where you want to serve your child a very good dish. You've done your research, you've got your ingredients, you've cooked the best food, but he's already had food at his nursery. You can't force food through him, right? And that's why delivery is really important. How well crafted is your narrative? From where I see things in the central role where negotiations fail is you overfeed information, you overwhelm people with lots of information without thinking about the 3 things that they need to know to take that decision. You go on and on and on, not giving time for questions. These are really simple things, but people, this is where things go wrong, not speaking too fast as well. This was a biggest issue with me in my initial years of my career, because I used to be so passionate about stuff. And that was my general communication style of, being like really fast. You tend to lose people, because if they can't follow what you're saying, because they are not close to the subject as you are, you lose the battle then and there, despite all the listening, all the research, all the great analysis and impact that you've done, despite the fact that they will lose if they don't listen to you, right? And these things are really important. And I say so because negotiation happens in you applying for a job as well. You are negotiating for someone to give you that chance, for someone to work with you. And this is where candidates also go wrong in interviews. When you're not answering the question, you're going off, speaking too fast. So yeah, those are the things that I would say avoid. Don't start with judgments, start with humility, do your research, listen well, phase, break down your approach. And lastly, this was something that one of my seniors said to me months ago. Don't be black and white, be gray about things. Because when it's negotiation, it's not this or this. Leave room for that gray space to prevail, because that's where things change in your favor. So yeah, that's my answer.
The audience is saying Neelu is on fire. And there's some bombs being thrown into the chat. Love it. I think, Neelu's point there specifically around delivery and not getting frustrated when it doesn't go your way is where CQ strategy comes in. So as much as we have done our research, so our CQ knowledge about what we want to achieve through that negotiation, or our CQ drive is really high because we are motivated to achieve what we want to achieve through the negotiation. Things are not going our way. How do you flex and adapt? And that's where the strategy comes in. So
and I was just going to comment to that,
yeah.
Ritika. We know from the research that actually the drive and strategy tends to be a stronger predictor of effective negotiation than the knowledge piece, which seems a bit counterintuitive. Like, I have to know all this information, but oftentimes it's this humility, this perseverance, the drive, and it's the how am I strategizing in the midst, allowing for the gray, not going in with a fixed mindset. So anyway, I interrupted you, but I just wanted to.
No, that's exactly. So while you're on stage, Dave, real life examples of how to use CQ to negotiate effectively. Just conscious of time, everybody gets to give one example because we've got some amazing questions that have come in. Sorry, Dave.
Okay. Dang, you didn't warn me of that one. Okay. All right. 1.5. I'm just going to start with my half of saying, Neelu, it's interesting in some ways. Here's my own cultural bias. I cringed when you talked about the way you greet your in-laws. I'm like, no. Is that like bowing down? You know, my own Western assumption. And I look at the rest of you panelists like, this is Mr. Cultural Intelligence. But what that evoked in me is that reminder that there's another dilemma in negotiation of when is it like, I know what the other party wants me to do, but it now would violate who I am personally. And I'm not suggesting that that's what your in-laws scenario is, but Ritika, that leads to my example of where I'm thinking about there's been situations in Monica's region of the world where she's based, where I was with another party who was a person of color, and everybody was saying I needed to be the one who led the way in the negotiation because they were going to more respect the white male coming in, etc. And I'm like, over my dead body, that perpetuates everything that I'm against. And yet we had this ethical dilemma on our side of a team of like, so how do you negotiate your own kind of commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion to what's going to help us win the deal? So I would just say that really factors in for me as how I think about it. One specific thing that I would say about where I didn't accurately use my CQ to negotiate is a few years ago, we were doing a lot of work with one of the largest corporations in Japan. I won't mention them right now, but I'm Mr. Cultural Intelligence. I know that Japanese culture is very hospitable and warm and kind and gracious and deferential. And so I go in and I'm doing a lot of this kind of relationship building, and Dave, trying to be charming, etc. And I encountered the most aggressive negotiators I had ever had in my life, where they just kept asking for the price to go down lower. They kept asking for more. And then when I talked to some of my coaches who were Japanese background later, they're like, yeah, you were negotiating with this company in Japan. If you had done your CQ strategy, we would have known that what you were experiencing was not unusual at all. You get this very kind deferential, but at least in that organization, they're definitely going to expect you to be ready. And also, I kept saying, I'll need to check with my team on that. And that really disempowered me in their views. Like, why can't you answer for this? We thought you were the president of the organization. So anyway, that was really cheating on your one example, but many, many more to share.
Thanks, Dave. Those are very interesting examples. Monica, I'm interested to hear your real life examples.
I have so many, but since I'm in Saudi Arabia right now, and I wanted to talk about it a little bit earlier, was me trying to be a good host, also for some business contacts. And so I prepared some Saudi coffee, which is delicious. A lot of cardamom and green coffee, actually beans, with saffron and so on and so forth. And I just wanted to be nice. And so everything was perfect. I had done my homework, brought some Arabic sweets, burned some incense in the house. So everything was perfect. I also wore some decent long dress and so on and so forth. So I had my business guests coming over, and I poured the coffee. And I held the kettle with my right hand, because that's the hand that I usually use to pour coffee, and the coffee cup with my left hand. And I offered the coffee with the left hand. And the person that I was offering the coffee to, mind you, I lived in Saudi for a very long time, never imagined that would have been like a horrible way to say no about business. So the person did take the coffee from me, and the deal didn't go ahead because I was speaking their language. I was speaking proper Saudi, and he thought it was an insult. And so I learned my lesson, and now everything that I offer to anybody in Saudi Arabia is with my right hand, because it's part of the culture. And it's lovely to actually know all these little things, because to be frank, I should have known them from before, and I didn't. They make all the difference. It was really nice, and to actually learn it. I did lose the deal though, but we made it later. 10 years later, I met with them again and served the coffee with my right hand.
With your right hand. There you go. There you go. Great example. Neelu, do you want to close that with an example before we move to questions?
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to clarify that I'm really very proud of my Indian culture, and there is no harm. I have a lot of respect for my in-laws and everyone. It's a cultural norm which I respect and I'm very proud of. I want to clarify that. The second thing around the example, I would say, just to make it really practical for the audience who are probably thinking about negotiating stuff with seniors, if they're DEI leads on strategies, always start with the term pilot. It works like magic. Don't try to change the whole world in one go. Don't try to make someone eat an elephant in one go. Say that let's try to start with a prototype. When you try to reduce risk for the other person by reducing the scale of the implementation of your negotiation concept, it's easier for them to buy into it. So that's one thing. I've got lots of success stories within what I've done in the bank by using the term pilot, as an example being Ritika and Dave's training on CQ within the Bank of England as well. And the second example was a success story on Teams transformation, where I was dealing with people who had been doing their job for 10 years. I came in as a new manager and I saw that some things were not making sense at all. And because the team was doing that job for such a long time, they started making sense of the things that made no sense. That was their truth, that they should be doing that stuff. I clearly saw that there was no connection between their work and our divisional priorities, my team's priorities. And then it was about creating a link, negotiating with them to help me negotiate with my seniors that we shouldn't be doing this, by creating a strong sense of purpose, by helping them understand that if they would help me, they can do more lucrative work within the division. It's good for their career progression. So it's about focusing on what is in it for them when you negotiate with your team members, by thinking about their purpose, their career progression, and their recognition as a result of it. So those were the two examples.
CQ drive writ large everywhere for yourself and the party that you're negotiating with. Thanks, three of you, amazing examples. I'm going to dive into the questions, and I'm just thinking we probably do need another hour even just to tackle the questions. Great question coming from Sarah. I would be interested to hear how power and position are considered by the panelists when negotiating, a senior leader, etc. How do you level up? Dave, do you want to take that one, or?
Yeah, I'll try to be quick because I know we're going to have a hard time getting to all these questions. Excellent question. One of the things that I always ask for ahead of time is an org chart, if at all possible. But then also, if at all possible, I like to have an insider who will give me, okay, so informally, who are the power players? What are the dynamics that I need to understand? So for me, the part of that is the CQ knowledge, like understanding in this culture where is likely power to be held, but then in the strategy piece, like actually doing some planning. So absolutely, I think about it a lot. If I can maybe handle another question that I saw in there as well, Ritika, somebody asked a really rich question of, but in many of our negotiations, it's not just, US and Indian culture or whatever else. It's got a whole plurality there. It's almost more in the nuance. So kind of to Monica's example, like we're not usually big proponents in the cultural intelligence work around the action of exactly how you pass the business card, et cetera. But, the use of the right hand, the passing of the business card to an individual can go a long way of like, wow, did you see that? They just actually used both hands to pass it to the individual who was from Japan, et cetera, without like calling it out. And then I think your goal becomes more like organizationally, what's the culture here and how do I need to understand what's there? So that's a 2 pence answer to a £1 million question, to defer to my CQ UK friends. But at least that's, I think the power and position and how you relate to a multiplicity of cultures are somewhat linked there.
Yeah, I love that. And I think Bessa has put a note in there to say that CQ should be at the UN, NATO. So Dave and I were in Davos earlier this year, and we just saw the relevance of CQ writ large, the type of negotiations happening, whether that was networking, whether that was talking to individuals. It was amazing. So yes, we're hoping everybody in the world wakes up to the fact that this is essential to do the work that you want to do. Moving on to the next question, Neelu, I'd like you to take that if possible. How do you navigate a blocker who's, let's say, the VP of compensation? What strategies do you use or suggest to be persistent when you have facts about low pay for the team?
First of all, I would start with the power of allies in this case. Often when I come across difficult stakeholders within the organization, and if I know that my rationale is making absolute sense by using others as a sounding board, not because just I believe in it, if 10 people tell me that, what you're talking is making sense, but I see that there is somebody influential in power is acting difficult about it, it would also be important to understand if they are operating within any limits, which is stopping them from being on your side. And often that might be the case. So I would say that be aware of this VP's position as well. How much in power are they to take your side? So that's the first thing. Secondly, try to build allies in the system. The voice of 5 is always more powerful than the voice of 1. If you're able to find ways to bring in facts, to produce a document to say, we've consulted with 500 people within the organization and we all collectively believe that this is good for us. It's very hard for seniors to not take that voice seriously when you're backing it with analysis, judgment, and allies. And I would also say that think about the timing and context. Often when we think it's a big issue, we are not aware of the person who is above us, who's looking at 10,000 such similar big issues. How important is that issue in the bigger scheme of things? And that's as important to be aware of in the wider context. Certainly, I know that within the bank, the governor is so keen on us being a human and humble bank, and he's done a fantastic job to cultivate that culture. But our primary responsibility is to be a central bank and to maintain financial stability of the financial system. And at the end of the day, I have to ensure that he's looking at the D&I agenda through the lens of 1,000 other important issues, which if break down, which have a very bad impact. So I think have empathy for the other side as well is what I would say.
Thank you, Neelu. Monica, I love this question. And it's perfect for you. It's coming from Sharon. What about negotiations with multiple cultures being represented? How do you navigate that, considering some cultures could be polar opposites? And what culture would you defer to?
So I think it's a great question. And in the world that we live in today, where we are super exposed to each other. So in the past, we really didn't know much about other cultures, but today we're super exposed. And so we, for example, in KPMG SLC, although it's the main office is in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, we have over 40 nationalities already within this, small organization between brackets. So it's already a world inside a world. And often we are sitting in the meeting room and there are 10 different nationalities. And then we're negotiating with another 2 different nationalities. The reality is that at this point, what I do is I look, listen, and mimic. I use that strategy pretty often. It does help me because sometimes the person that I'm speaking to comes from one background and maybe they are the decision makers. And so when I'm addressing myself to that person and I know that they're the decision maker, I work with the cultural intelligence that I have towards that specific area of the world. And if I'm speaking to a big group, generally I'm very neutral. So I don't express myself in whatever culture it is that I supposedly belong to. And it's very easy for me to actually be neutral. So I really don't refer to myself as any culture. And so people perceive that. People do see that, where's she from? And that's great because that helps in negotiations. I'm not part of this group nor from the other. I'm here to make business and I'm very, very genuine generally, and that helps a lot. So I'm just myself. I don't try to overdo things. I'm just very natural. I do a lot of homework though. And so people know that I'm assertive, that I have certain points that I need to negotiate, but I just use my neutral code. So that helps me, if that answers the question.
this absolutely answers the question. And we're almost at time. So many golden nuggets in this conversation where I can see that some of the qualities required for being a good negotiator, like curiosity, self-awareness, being courageous, being an active listener, having empathy, all of that is really what a culturally intelligent leader is. So there is a strong link between CQ and negotiation. I really want to thank our amazing and wonderful panelists for the insights, Monica, Dave, Neelu. I've thoroughly enjoyed learning and listening. Before people start signing off, if you've enjoyed this webinar, you're in for a treat because CQC UK, Cultural Intelligence Center UK, are hosting a free virtual conference on the 27th of April, CQ, Stories and Statistics, 3 hours of brilliant content with amazing speakers. Please sign up. You can post the link here, but it's also on our LinkedIn page, or do reach out to Emily. And we hope to see you all there. For now, thank you so much, Dave, Monica, and Neelu. It has been an amazing conversation, and I'm very grateful. Thank you to the audience as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ritika. Thank you, Dave. Hi, Monica.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day ahead or night.